The quickest way to discover who truly believes in you is to watch who speaks when they think your story is already over. My name is Daniel Brooks, and after 42 years of marriage, I never imagined that the most painful words I would ever hear would come from my mother-in-law instead of the woman I had loved for most of my life. The morning I walked into Thomas Reed's law office, I was not expecting comfort, sympathy, or even kindness. I was there for one simple reason. Rachel and I had agreed to sign the final documents ending our marriage, and I wanted the process to be respectful. I arrived 15 minutes early because that was how I had lived my entire life. I believed punctuality showed respect, even when relationships were falling apart. The receptionist greeted me politely and offered a cup of coffee while I waited. I thanked her and quietly took a seat near the conference room window. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk carrying briefcases, grocery bags, and coffee cups, completely unaware that one chapter of my life was about to close forever. A few minutes later, Rachel entered with her mother, Margaret Wilson. Rachel avoided looking directly at me, while Margaret walked with the confidence of someone convinced she had won a long battle. She had never truly approved of me. During the early years of our marriage, she tolerated me because Rachel loved me. Over time, however, every disagreement between Rachel and me became proof in Margaret's mind that I had never been good enough for her daughter. Thomas welcomed everyone into the conference room and carefully organized the paperwork across the polished wooden table. The atmosphere remained professional and quiet until Margaret suddenly leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and looked directly at me with a smile that carried no warmth. Then she spoke loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Leaving you was the best decision my daughter ever made." Her words echoed through the conference room with such certainty that even the receptionist outside briefly looked toward the open door. Rachel lowered her eyes, but said nothing. Thomas stopped arranging the documents and slowly removed his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with the remark. I simply looked at Margaret without anger. At 67 years old, I had learned that not every insult deserved an immediate response. Some moments required silence because the truth had a way of arriving on its own schedule. Margaret mistook my calm expression for defeat. She continued speaking. "Rachel wasted too many years carrying this marriage. Now she finally has a chance to enjoy her life." I noticed Rachel shift uneasily in her chair, but she still remained silent. I could have defended myself. I could have listed every mortgage payment I quietly made, every overtime shift I accepted, every vacation I postponed, every personal dream I sacrificed so our family could remain financially secure. I could have reminded them that when Rachel's father became seriously ill, I spent countless weekends repairing Margaret's house without charging her a single dollar. I could have mentioned the years I quietly helped pay medical expenses that insurance never covered. But none of those things would have changed Margaret's opinion because she had already decided who I was long before that morning. Thomas finally cleared his throat and gently asked everyone to remain focused on the legal documents. Before he could begin explaining the paperwork, his assistant hurried into the room carrying a sealed overnight envelope marked urgent. She whispered something into his ear before placing it on the table. Thomas looked at the sender's name, frowned slightly, and then glanced toward me with genuine surprise. He slowly picked up the envelope and said, "Before anyone signs these papers, there is something all of you need to see." In that moment, the confidence on Margaret's face began to fade, and although I had not expected that envelope to arrive that morning, I quietly realized the next 5 minutes were about to change everything. Thomas Reed carefully turned the sealed envelope over in his hands before breaking the security seal. The room fell completely silent. Even Margaret stopped speaking, apparently confident that whatever was inside could not possibly change anything. Thomas removed several neatly organized documents along with a handwritten cover letter. As he scanned the first page, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to genuine surprise. He slowly looked up at me before reading the sender's name aloud. This package was delivered by the law firm representing Harold Bennett. Rachel frowned because the name meant nothing to her. Margaret impatiently folded her arms again. "Can we please finish the divorce?" she asked. Thomas politely raised one hand. "I am afraid we cannot proceed until we review these documents. They directly affect matters discussed during today's appointment." Rachel finally looked at me for the first time that morning. I could see confusion replacing the certainty she had carried into the office. Thomas continued reading quietly before sliding one document toward the center of the table. Mr. Bennett has submitted a sworn financial statement together with supporting records concerning a loan agreement signed 21 years ago. Margaret sighed dramatically. What does an old loan have to do with my daughter ending an unhappy marriage? Thomas answered calmly. Quite a bit, based on what I am reading. He adjusted his glasses and continued. According to these records, Daniel personally guaranteed a substantial business loan for a manufacturing company owned by Rachel's late father after the company experienced severe financial difficulties. Rachel immediately shook her head. That cannot be right. My father never mentioned anything like that. I quietly replied. He promised he never would. Rachel stared at me, unable to understand. Thomas continued reviewing the file. The guarantee prevented the company from defaulting and protected several personal assets that had been pledged as collateral. Margaret leaned forward. What assets? Thomas answered without emotion. The family home, Mrs. Wilson's residence, several retirement accounts, and the commercial property that later funded your retirement. Margaret's confident posture disappeared almost instantly. She looked from Thomas to me and then back to the paperwork as though hoping someone would announce there had been a mistake. Rachel slowly whispered, Daniel, is this true? I nodded. Your father came to me one evening after everyone else had gone home from Thanksgiving dinner. His business was weeks away from collapsing. He was terrified that you and your mother would lose everything. He asked me not to tell either of you because he believed the stress would destroy your relationship with him. Rachel covered her mouth with one hand. Thomas continued reading from the accompanying letter. Mr. Bennett confirms that Daniel made every required payment after the business closed and refused reimbursement once the remaining assets were sold. Mr. Bennett also states that Daniel requested complete confidentiality to preserve family harmony. Margaret slowly sat back in her chair. For the first time since entering the office, she had nothing to say. Rachel looked at me with tears beginning to form. You worked all those extra weekends, she quietly said. You told me the company simply needed experienced contractors. I gave a small nod. That explanation was easier than telling you your father believed he had failed the family. Silence settled over the conference room again. No one reached for the divorce papers. No one argued. Thomas carefully organized the documents before speaking once more. There is additional information in this package, including several personal letters written by Rachel's father before his passing. Based on the legal instructions accompanying these records, I strongly recommend that everyone remain seated until we review the remaining contents. As he lifted the next sealed envelope from the folder, I realized the truth I had protected for more than 2 decades was only beginning to reveal itself, and what came next would challenge everything Rachel and Margaret believed about the man they thought they had already judged. Thomas carefully opened the second sealed envelope and removed a stack of handwritten letters held together with a faded blue ribbon. He examined the first page before looking toward Rachel. These letters were written by your father during the final years of his life, he said quietly. He instructed Mr. Bennett to release them only if Daniel ever faced accusations concerning his character or integrity. Rachel stared at the papers as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Margaret remained completely silent, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Thomas unfolded the first letter with great care and began reading aloud. To my daughter Rachel, if you are hearing these words, then circumstances have forced the truth into the open. Daniel asked me many times to destroy this letter because he never wanted recognition for what he did. I refused because one day you deserve to know the kind of husband you married. Rachel slowly lowered her head while Thomas continued. When my business failed, I believed I had destroyed our family's future. Banks were preparing legal action, and I was certain your mother would lose the house she loved. Daniel came to my office after working a full day and quietly signed papers placing his own financial future at risk to protect ours. He never complained. He never asked for anything in return. He only asked that you never carry the burden of knowing how close we came to losing everything. Thomas paused for a moment before continuing with the next paragraph. During the following 6 years, Daniel worked evenings, weekends, and holidays to repay obligations that were never his responsibility. Every time you believed he was working overtime for career advancement, he was actually protecting our family from consequences that should have belonged to me. Rachel covered her face with trembling hands. I remembered every one of those years as though they had happened yesterday. There were mornings when I left home before sunrise and returned long after dinner because another payment was due. I missed fishing trips with friends, postponed vacations, and quietly sold the classic motorcycle I had spent years restoring. Rachel had noticed the motorcycle was gone, but I simply told her I had lost interest in the hobby. The truth was that selling it covered 1 month's loan payment. Thomas reached another page. Daniel also refused every offer of repayment after my financial situation improved. He said family was never an investment expecting profit. He believed helping loved ones was simply part of the promise he made when he married my daughter. Margaret slowly whispered, "I never knew." I looked toward her with calm honesty. "Your husband asked me to promise that neither you nor Rachel would ever carry guilt over his business." I gave him my word. Rachel finally looked at me through tearful eyes. "All those nights I complained that you were never home for dinner." I gave a small smile filled with sadness rather than resentment. "You had every right to wonder why I was working so much. I just could not tell you the reason." Thomas placed the first letter aside before lifting another. "There is one final section your father specifically requested I read today." The room became completely still again. "Rachel, if life ever convinces you that Daniel is not enough, remember that the greatest acts of love are usually the ones performed quietly. Do not measure your husband by what he chooses to say about himself. Measure him by what he sacrifices when nobody is watching." Thomas carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. No one spoke. The only sound came from the wall clock softly marking each passing second. Rachel stared at the table while tears silently fell onto the polished wood. Margaret looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, one without judgment or certainty. Thomas then reached into the folder once more and quietly said, "There is still one document remaining, and I believe it may be the most important one your father left behind." At that moment, I realized the deepest secret I had protected for more than 20 years was still waiting inside that final envelope, and once it was opened, none of our lives would ever look the same again. Thomas placed the final envelope on the table and looked at each of us before speaking. "This document is different from the others," he explained. "Your father did not write this as a legal statement. He wrote it as a final message to his family." Rachel reached toward the envelope but stopped before touching it. The emotions in the room had changed completely. Only an hour earlier, I had been sitting across from the woman I once called my wife, while her mother declared that leaving me was the best decision Rachel had ever made. Now we were surrounded by evidence of a lifetime of choices that nobody had fully understood. Thomas carefully removed the final letter and unfolded the pages. "Rachel, before you read this yourself, there is something you should know. Your father asked me to keep this letter private because he believed timing mattered. He did not want you to feel obligated to stay in any relationship because of what Daniel had done. He only wanted you to understand the truth before making decisions about the people in your life." Those words caught my attention because they sounded exactly like the man I remembered. Harold Bennett was proud, but he was also fair. He never wanted anyone to feel trapped by gratitude. Thomas began reading. "My dear Rachel, I know you love your mother, and I know you have spent years trying to make everyone happy. But sometimes, when we listen too closely to the opinions of others, we forget to see the people standing beside us." Rachel closed her eyes as the words continued. "Daniel is not perfect. Nobody is. But during the hardest season of my life, he showed me a level of loyalty and kindness that many people only talk about. He protected our family when he had every reason to protect himself. He carried responsibilities that were never his because he believed love meant showing up when things became difficult." Margaret quietly looked down at the table. For the first time, I saw regret on her face. Thomas continued reading. "If you ever find yourself judging Daniel by one disagreement, one difficult year, or one painful moment, remember that a marriage is not built from one day. It is built from thousands of ordinary choices made over decades." Rachel wiped her eyes. "Dad knew," she whispered. "He knew I was unhappy." I answered softly, "Your father knew you were struggling. He never blamed you. He always believed people could find their way back when they were willing to be honest." Thomas handed the letter to Rachel. She read the remaining pages silently while Margaret sat beside her without saying a word. I watched Rachel's expression change as she moved through each paragraph. The anger and certainty she had carried into the room were slowly replaced by sadness and reflection. After several minutes, she placed the letter down carefully. "Daniel, Why did you never tell me any of this? She asked. I looked at her and answered honestly. Because I never wanted your love to come from feeling like you owed me something. I wanted you to choose me because you wanted to, not because you discovered I had sacrificed things for you. Rachel looked away, overwhelmed by the answer. Thomas gathered the documents together and said, "This is why your father requested this meeting happen before any final decisions. He believed the truth deserved to be known before the future was decided." Outside the office window, the afternoon sunlight had begun to fade across the city streets. The divorce papers remained untouched on the table. For the first time that morning, nobody seemed focused on ending something. Instead, everyone was trying to understand what had been lost and whether something valuable could still be rebuilt. As we prepared to leave, Margaret approached me slowly. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Daniel, I owe you an apology." I simply nodded and listened, because after all those years of silence, I knew the next words she spoke would reveal whether she truly understood the damage caused by her judgment. Margaret stood quietly beside the conference table with both hands folded in front of her. The confidence that had filled her voice only an hour earlier had completely disappeared. She looked older than she had when she first entered Thomas Reed's office, as though the weight of the truth had settled across her shoulders all at once. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Daniel, I judged you for years without knowing the full story. I believed I was protecting my daughter, but I never stopped to ask whether I truly understood the man standing in front of me. I listened without interrupting because an apology means very little unless it is offered freely." Margaret continued, "When I told you that Rachel leaving you was the best decision she had ever made, I believed every word. Now I realize I said something deeply unfair to someone who spent decades protecting this family." Her voice became quieter. "I cannot take those words back, but I hope you will accept that I finally understand the damage they caused." I gave her a respectful nod. "Thank you for saying that." She looked surprised by my calm response. "That is all?" she asked softly. I smiled gently. An honest apology does not need a long speech in return. Rachel remained seated, holding her father's letters against her chest. She had barely spoken since Thomas finished reading them. Finally, she looked toward me with eyes filled with regret. "Daniel, there is something I need to ask." I quietly waited. "Over the last few years, every time my mother questioned our marriage, why did you never defend yourself?" I thought carefully before answering because the truth deserved simple words. "Because I believed if I argued with your mother, you would feel forced to choose between us. I never wanted to put you in that position." Rachel lowered her head. Instead, I slowly chose her opinion without realizing it. Thomas carefully gathered the legal documents into separate folders while allowing the conversation to continue naturally. Rachel looked at the divorce papers lying untouched on the table. "I spent months convincing myself our marriage had failed because we had grown apart," she admitted. "Now I am beginning to wonder whether I stopped seeing you clearly long before that." I answered honestly. "Every marriage changes over time. We both made mistakes. I worked too much and often believed solving problems quietly was enough. I should have shared more of my burdens with you instead of carrying everything alone." Rachel looked surprised. "After everything that has happened, you are still willing to admit your own mistakes." I gave a faint smile. Marriage was never supposed to be about keeping score. Those words seemed to affect her more deeply than anything else said that day. Thomas finally cleared his throat. "Since neither of you has signed these documents, there is no legal requirement to complete the divorce today. The choice remains entirely yours." Rachel immediately looked toward me, but I gently raised one hand before she could speak. "Please do not make any decision today," I said. "Not because of these letters. Not because of guilt, and certainly not because of what your father did for us. If you ever decide to rebuild what we had, it should happen because you truly believe it is the right choice." Rachel slowly nodded while tears quietly rolled down her face. Margaret reached over and placed one comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder, but this time she said nothing. As we walked out of the law office together, the afternoon air felt cooler than when we had arrived. Rachel stood beside her car for several moments before softly asking, "Would you be willing to meet me again after we both have time to think?" I looked at her and answered with complete honesty. "Yes, I believe difficult conversations deserve calm minds." She thanked me with a small, grateful smile before driving away with Margaret. I watched their car disappear into the afternoon traffic, believing the day had finally come to an end. Then my phone vibrated. The message came from our daughter, Olivia. It contained only one sentence. Dad, Mom finally told me everything, and there is something you need to know before either of you makes another decision. Olivia's message stayed on my phone screen during the entire drive home. I had expected the day to end with quiet reflection, not another unexpected turn. Instead of going directly to my apartment, I pulled into a small public park where Rachel and I had often brought Olivia when she was a little girl. I sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake before calling her. She answered almost immediately. Her voice sounded calm but emotional. Dad, I did not want to text everything. I just needed you to know before anyone made another decision. I listened quietly. Mom came to my house after leaving the law office. Olivia explained. She brought Grandpa's letters and asked me to read every one of them. She cried almost the entire time. I closed my eyes for a moment. Hearing that did not make me feel victorious. It only reminded me how much pain had accumulated inside our family without anyone recognizing it soon enough. Olivia continued. Dad, there is something I have wanted to tell you for years, but I never found the courage. Her words immediately caught my attention. What is it? I asked gently. She took a slow breath. Mom loved you far longer than either of you realized. She just allowed outside opinions to become louder than her own heart. I remained silent while she continued. Grandma never stopped reminding Mom that she could have married someone wealthier or more ambitious. At first, Mom defended you every time. Then, little by little, she stopped arguing because it became exhausting. Eventually, she began questioning things she had never questioned before. I looked across the calm water as her words settled into my thoughts. Did your mother ever tell you that? I asked. Not directly, Olivia answered. But I watched it happen. Every family dinner, every holiday, every conversation somehow became another comparison, another criticism, another reason she should expect more from life. I remembered many of those evenings. Whenever Margaret questioned one of my decisions, I usually smiled politely and changed the subject. I believed avoiding conflict protected everyone. Looking back, perhaps silence had protected the arguments while allowing misunderstandings to grow. Olivia spoke again. Dad, Grandpa understood exactly what was happening. That is why he admired you so much. He once told me that the strongest people are not the loudest people. They are the ones who continue choosing kindness after being misunderstood. I smiled sadly because those words sounded exactly like Harold Bennett. There is something else, Olivia said softly. Mom found an old journal while cleaning the attic last night. She discovered entries she wrote nearly 20 years ago. I asked what they said. Olivia laughed quietly through her tears. Page after page about how grateful she was for you. She wrote about the day you stayed awake all night building my science fair project after working a 12-hour shift. She wrote about the camping trips, Christmas mornings, and how safe she always felt whenever you walked through the front door. She even wrote that marrying you had been the best decision of her life. I leaned back against the bench and looked toward the fading afternoon sky. Sometimes life has a painful way of reminding people that the truth they once believed can slowly become buried beneath years of ordinary frustration. Olivia's voice became hopeful. Dad, Mom told me she does not want to ask you to come home. She thinks she has already asked too much of you. She only wants one opportunity to tell you everything without pride getting in the way. I answered honestly. She deserves that opportunity. After ending the call, I remained by the lake until sunset. When I finally returned to my apartment, I found a small package resting outside my front door. There was no return address, only my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was Rachel's old journal together with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please read the woman I used to be before deciding whether she is gone forever." The journal stayed on my kitchen table for nearly an hour before I finally opened it. I had spent decades believing I understood Rachel's thoughts, her worries, and her dreams. Yet somehow, I had never seen the words she wrote when nobody else was watching. The first page was dated shortly after we bought our first home. Her handwriting looked younger, more energetic, and filled with the excitement of someone building a future with the person she loved. The opening sentence immediately stopped me. Today, Daniel surprised me by fixing the broken fence before I even mentioned it. He always notices the things everyone else ignores. I continued reading slowly. Page after page revealed memories I had forgotten, but Rachel had preserved. She wrote about simple moments that had never seemed important to me. The night we stayed awake talking in our empty apartment because we could not afford furniture yet. The morning I made pancakes for Olivia before taking a long shift at work. The weekend we painted the living room together and laughed because neither of us knew what we were doing. They were ordinary moments, but Rachel had seen them as pieces of a beautiful life. Then I reached the later entries. The tone began to change. The warmth was still there, but uncertainty had entered her writing. She described feeling overwhelmed, comparing our life to the lives of people around us, and wondering whether she had missed opportunities. She wrote about conversations with Margaret that slowly influenced the way she viewed our marriage. One entry from 5 years earlier caught my attention. Mom says Daniel is too comfortable with a simple life. She thinks I should expect more. But I know Daniel is the reason I have peace. I do not know why I let those comments bother me. I stopped reading for a moment. It was the first time I saw the conflict Rachel had been carrying inside. She had not suddenly stopped loving me. She had slowly allowed doubt to grow where trust once lived. As I continued, I found another entry written only months before our separation. I am angry, but I do not know exactly why. Daniel has never betrayed me. He has always been there. Maybe I am disappointed in myself and blaming the person closest to me because it feels easier. I closed the journal and stared at the wall. Those words hurt more than any accusation Margaret had ever made because they revealed something I had never understood. Rachel had been fighting a battle within herself, and I had been too focused on keeping peace to recognize it. The next morning, I called Rachel and asked if she would meet me at a quiet coffee shop near the park. When she arrived, she looked nervous but hopeful. She noticed the journal in my hand and immediately lowered her eyes. "I was afraid you would read it," she said softly. I answered, "I was grateful that you allowed me to." She looked surprised. "Why?" I smiled gently. "Because for the first time in years, I heard your voice without anyone else influencing it." Rachel became emotional but remained silent. After a few moments, she said, "Daniel, I do not expect you to forget what happened. I do not even know if I deserve another chance. But I need you to know that the woman who made those decisions was lost. She was listening to everyone except herself." I looked at her carefully. "And what does your own voice say now?" She took a deep breath before answering. "It says I lost sight of the person who loved me most because I was chasing a version of happiness that was never real." We sat there quietly, not as husband and wife trying to fix everything in one conversation, but as two people finally being honest after years of avoiding difficult truths. Before we left, Rachel reached across the table and said something I never expected to hear. "I am not asking you to come back today. I am only asking if we can start learning how to talk to each other again." I looked at the woman I had shared most of my life with and realized that sometimes rebuilding does not begin with returning to the past. It begins with finally understanding it. Over the following weeks, Rachel and I met several more times, never with the expectation that one conversation could repair everything that had taken years to unravel. Sometimes we walked through the small park where Olivia had learned to ride her bicycle. Sometimes we shared coffee at the same quiet corner table. Other days we simply talked while sitting on a bench overlooking the lake. We spoke honestly about subjects we had avoided for far too long. Rachel admitted that she had gradually confused comfort with disappointment. She had allowed comparisons to replace gratitude, and she accepted full responsibility for letting other voices become louder than her own judgment. I admitted something equally important. By trying to protect everyone from worry, I had also protected them from understanding me. I believed carrying every burden alone was an act of love, but it had quietly built an invisible wall between us. Rachel deserved the opportunity to stand beside me during difficult seasons instead of discovering the truth years later through someone else's letters. One Saturday afternoon, Olivia invited both of us to her home for dinner. She made it clear that there was no expectation beyond sharing a meal together as a family. Margaret was already there when I arrived. The moment she saw me, she stood up from the dining table and walked toward me with a gentle smile that carried none of the pride she once displayed. "Daniel," she said quietly, "there is something I have wanted to do properly." She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. "I realized that saying I was sorry once was not enough," she explained. "You deserve to know exactly what I was apologizing for." Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I read every word. Margaret admitted that she had spent years judging me through assumptions instead of observations. She confessed that she often mistook quiet strength for lack of ambition because she measured success by visible achievements instead of consistent character. She thanked me for protecting Harold's dignity, for caring for their family without asking for recognition, and for treating her with respect even when she had not returned the same kindness. At the bottom of the page, she had written one simple sentence. I hope one day you can remember me for who I am trying to become instead of who I was. I folded the letter carefully because I believed sincere accountability deserved to be preserved. During the next family dinner, something unexpected happened. Margaret publicly apologized again, this time in front of Olivia and the grandchildren. She did not make excuses or blame grief, age, or misunderstanding. She simply accepted responsibility for the influence her words had carried over the years. Rachel quietly reached for her mother's hand, not because everything had been solved, but because honesty had finally replaced denial. As I watched them, I realized healing often begins when one person becomes willing to tell the complete truth. After dinner, Rachel and I remained on the back porch while everyone else cleaned the kitchen. The evening air was cool, and the familiar sound of wind moving through the trees reminded me of countless nights we had spent there together. Rachel looked toward the backyard before speaking. I cannot ask you to trust me again overnight, she said. Trust belongs to you now. If it ever returns, I want it to happen naturally. I appreciated those words because they carried no pressure. I answered honestly. Trust grows through consistent choices, not emotional promises. She nodded with quiet understanding. Before I left, she handed me a small key attached to our old wooden keychain. This is still yours, she said softly. Whether you ever use it again is completely your decision. I slipped the key into my pocket without making any promises. As I drove away beneath the warm evening sky, I realized our story was no longer about proving who had been right or wrong. It had become a story about whether humility, patience, and truth could accomplish what pride never could. And for the first time in many years, that possibility felt real. 1 year after that difficult morning at Thomas Reed's office, I stood on the same front porch where I once believed my entire life had ended. The house looked exactly the same, yet everything about it felt different. The old wooden railing had been repaired, the garden had been carefully maintained, and the small details that once represented years of shared effort no longer felt like reminders of pain. They felt like reminders of everything we had survived. Rachel and I did not rebuild our marriage through one emotional conversation or one perfect apology. We rebuilt it through hundreds of small choices made over time. We learned to speak honestly instead of assuming. We learned to ask questions instead of creating conclusions. Most importantly, we learned that love requires attention even after decades together. The biggest change was not that Rachel returned to my life. It was that both of us became different people than we had been before. Rachel no longer measured happiness by what others thought she deserved. She found peace in the simple moments she once overlooked. She spent more time with family, volunteered at the community center, and often reminded Olivia that a meaningful life was not created by appearances or possessions. Margaret also changed in ways I never expected. She became one of the first people to admit when she was wrong. She once told me that losing my trust was the greatest consequence of her judgment, not because she wanted forgiveness immediately, but because she finally understood that respect must be earned through actions. As for Rachel and me, we took our time. We did not pretend the painful months had never happened. We talked about them when necessary because avoiding the truth was what created the distance between us in the first place. Eventually, after many conversations and many quiet moments of rebuilding, Rachel asked me a question I had never expected to hear again. We were sitting on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset behind the trees. She looked at me and said, "Do you think there is still a place for me beside you?" I looked at the woman who had shared most of my life, the woman who had made mistakes but had also found the courage to face them. I answered honestly, "There is always room for someone who is willing to grow." A few months later, we renewed our vows in a small family gathering at Olivia's home. There were no expensive decorations, no large celebration, and no attempt to recreate the past. Instead, we stood surrounded by the people who mattered most and promised to move forward with greater honesty than before. Margaret sat in the front row with tears in her eyes, and afterwards she hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for giving our family another chance." I smiled because I knew the truth. I had not given anyone another chance alone. Everyone had earned it through humility and change. Looking back now, I realized the cruelest words I ever heard were not the ones that hurt me the most. The hardest part was knowing that the person I loved had briefly forgotten the person I had always tried to be. But sometimes people lose their way before they find a better path. The greatest victories in life are not always about proving someone else wrong. Sometimes they are about finding peace after being misunderstood. I never needed Margaret to admit I was a good man. I never needed Rachel to apologize forever. I only needed the truth to finally be seen. And in the end, the thing that saved our family was not a legal document, a financial decision, or a perfect explanation. It was the simple understanding that love is not proven by what someone says when everything is easy. Love is revealed by what people choose to do when everything falls apart.